Hello, my name is Michael DeWan Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach with over 40 years of experience. And in this video, I'll be offering a critical questioning of what I call woke psychotherapy, which is a shorthand term for the application of critical social justice theory to the education of therapists and the practice of psychotherapy. I'll also begin to offer an alternative for understanding and teaching and practicing with an appreciation for diversity within the field of psychotherapy. The general focus of this channel has been on personal development, any topic related to personal development with an emphasis on practical things that you can do to further your development. So the topic of woke psychotherapy isn't precisely aligned, but I do believe that it's important and relevant. I hope that psychotherapists and coaches will find an interest in this, as you've probably become aware of how these ideas are influencing the field of your practice. And if you're not a psychotherapist or a coach, you may also find it interesting because it's touching your life one way or another. And it might be that if you learn more about it, you might be able to make certain informed decisions about what kind of therapist or what kind of coach you want to work with. Beyond offering a critique of woke psychotherapy, I'm also hoping that this channel can provide a sense of community for like-minded people who are interested in this topic, perhaps even having concerns, a place that you can come and leave comments and dialogue with each other, share your ideas, share your experiences, share your resources, and question me. If you think that I've missed something or gotten something wrong, you can let me know. I'm hoping that I'll learn from this process as well. But I want it to be a place that you can come to continue to pursue an interest in this topic. Depending on the interest and the engagement that comes from this video, my hope is that I'll continue indefinitely to make videos about this topic. In the meantime, however, I will continue to post videos on the general topic of personal development. I am well aware of the risks involved in speaking out on this topic, but my conscience will no longer allow me to remain silent. There are others who are pushing back, and I want to offer my voice to theirs and further questioning this and seeing if there's a better way to do it. So that's the purpose of this video and future ones that I hope to post. Please stick with me for this entire video as I unpack my critique of woke psychotherapy and offer an alternative. First, however, I want to talk a little bit about myself and give you some idea of why I'm interested and why I might have something of value to say. My interest in diversity really goes back to my early 20s when I had a fascination with cultural anthropology, which resulted eventually in me earning a bachelor's degree in cultural anthropology. I was endlessly fascinated by the way humans throughout the world and throughout time went about life in different ways. They created families differently. They ate differently. They celebrated holy days differently. They moved through life transitions differently. They related to their neighbors differently. They governed themselves differently. So many things were different. And at the center of my education, a message I kept hearing, and one that I really took to heart and has stayed with me since, is the recognition of the possibility of ethnocentrism or ethnocentricity, which is privileging one's own culture, thinking that it's the best and that it's the only way to go about things. I began to see in vivid detail that people lived differently and they had meaningful lives. They had different ways of making meaning, but they were valid. And so this was early and this stayed with me. Still stays with me. Also in my early 20s, as a student and practitioner within the Kagyu tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, I took my refuge vows, and then I took my bodhisattva vows. And my bodhisattva vows, what they're about, is declaring one's intention to devote one's life to the relieving of suffering for all sentient beings. And this is all sentient beings. in this universe or any possible universe. It's an impossible task, and I recognized it at the time, but nevertheless, that's what I decided I would devote my life to. And it's what led me to ultimately becoming a psychotherapist. And the point here is all sentient beings, not just one's group, not just the ones you like, but all sentient beings. That one's life be devoted to a recognition of suffering and what one can do to relieve it where possible. Okay, fast forward many years. I'm in my early 50s and I'm living in London, and I'm practicing privately as a psychotherapist. And I was hired for a training program to work with a training program as a teacher or tutor for students of psychotherapy within the integrative model. I've held various roles within my involvement with the school. One was that I was the co-head of the second year of training. I also facilitated experiential training groups, which are basically like psychotherapy groups for training psychotherapists. I supervised both second and third year students as they began to do their clinical work. We met in groups of 4. And the other thing that I did, which I want to emphasize, is that I took on the diversity class, teaching diversity. And it's a bit interesting how I got that position. I was accepted, I volunteered to take over for a class that was called Conflict. It was a woman who quit teaching that. And I was preparing and looking at her curriculum and thinking how I was going to do it. And then it came down that this was not going to be conflict anymore. It was going to be a new topic that's sort of related. And it was a mandate, I think, came through Middlesex University, which is the university that school is affiliated with, and probably also the United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy. And the training of therapists became mandatory, that some form of diversity be included in their training. So there was going to be this new class called diversity. I was given freedom to create the curriculum and not much guidance on what it ought to include. So I had to think this over quite a lot. And having for decades studied integral theory, it seemed to me that this was a very good framework to unpack notions of diversity. So I built a curriculum around that, which I will begin to share at some point. But so I taught this for 5 years. And what that involved was the first couple years I would teach 3 classes a week. And each class was 3 hours long. And it would go for 10 weeks. And then there would be another round, another half of the year, where we would do this again. And all in all, I probably logged over 600 hours in teaching this course. On top of that, there were essays, 2 essays each term, and I read hundreds of essays and marked hundreds of essays on various topics related to diversity. This really gave me an opportunity to think about, in breadth and depth, the notion of what is diversity and how does it relate to psychotherapy. I was aware at the time, and even more so as time has gone on, that it's very unusual. It's a fluke, really, that somebody like me, a white, male, heterosexual, would teach a course on diversity. But nevertheless, I did have that opportunity, which I'm very grateful for. And that experience also informs what I'm going to have to say in the course of this in future videos on the topic of woke psychotherapy. Despite the fact that I'm white, male, and heterosexual, I don't think I can be accused of not having thought a lot about this topic. There may be certain experiences that I haven't had, but I've put in my time. And I think I do have something of value to say. And I think by this point, perhaps you're getting the impression that I couldn't really fairly be characterized as an alt-right fanatic. Thanks for sticking with me through these preliminary comments. But please stay with me for the meat of this video, which will be my critique of woke psychotherapy and the beginning of an offering of an alternative. Now I want to launch into my critique, but before I do, I want to steelman woke psychotherapy, which means I want to acknowledge its moments of truth. I want to acknowledge the underlying good intentions that it has, and not oversimplify, not create a straw man and attack it. I think that this is a generally good principle, and one that I hope can be carried on if you join the dialogue on this channel, that you will steelman whoever you're critiquing. Anyway, so how do I steelman woke psychotherapy? First thing I want to say to steelman woke psychotherapy is to acknowledge one of its fundamental premises, one of the foundational ideas, as I understand it, for critical social justice, which is postmodern thought, postmodern philosophy. And this is an examination of our idea of objective truth, and recognizing that we tend to make it up, in a sense. Individually and collectively, we construct reality by the way we think about it. And whether there's a solid reality that we have to contend with or not is questioned. I think that there is a moment of truth in postmodern thought. It has a very corrosive, exaggerated form, but it's valuable, it's important, and useful to be able to look at the way we construct truth, whether it's our individual truth or the truth that we accept from our group, and question it. Recognize that it's been put together. When we can do that, we can be open to other information, anomalies in our experience that aren't covered by our beliefs, and we can modify our beliefs, modify the way we understand things. This is tremendously useful. And so I recognize that within the critical social justice movement, that there is some truth there. And we'll come back and see where that goes too far, but for now I'm still manning this argument. The next moment of truth that I want to acknowledge is that injustice does occur for a variety of reasons, many of them due to prejudice. People are not treated fairly. Individuals and groups in particular can be marginalized and not receive a fair shake. And this can even be systemic. There can be things kind of cooked into our way of operating, whether institutionally or legally, that could disadvantage certain groups of people for no other reason but some innate trait and due to prejudice. So I acknowledge that. The degree to which it happens and how to measure it and make sure that that's what's happening is another question, but I don't dispute that. I will give a nod to that and say, yes, that's true, true enough. Another thing that I agree with is that when we become aware of an injustice, it's morally justifiable, if not a moral obligation, to do something about it, to do what we can to improve our world and see if we can remove that injustice. So I agree with that. I agree that there is a place for activism for social justice. Another thing I recognize is that psychotherapy clients may experience forms of injustice and discrimination and prejudice in their lives, and that this may contribute to why they're coming to psychotherapy, and that it should be the responsibility of therapists to be aware of those possibilities and to cultivate the skills to be able to work with them if and when they show up in the consulting room. So there is a place. The degree to which that happens, I think, is something that we can look at in a little finer detail later. But as a general principle, I acknowledge that. Okay, so for now, that's enough steel manning, and I'm ready to offer my critique. I think the bell has rung, and it's time to get off the ropes and come to the center of the ring and have at it. Let's go. The first point of my critique has to do with the idea of diversity altogether. What does it mean? When I created my curriculum, I defined diversity to myself as human difference. Any and every way that people can be different. It became my perception over time that from the point of view of woke psychotherapy, there are a small handful of ways that we're different that seem to be worthy of our attention and worthy of doing something about. From an integral point of view, I saw that there's many, many, many ways that are interesting and consequential in terms of how we're different, and that intersectionality, if taken to its logical conclusion, means that everybody is unique, because there's so many intersections. Not just three. It's not just race, gender, sexuality. Sometimes throw in ableism or class. Sometimes there are so many other forms of diversity that I think are worthy of us paying attention to. Later, I'll unpack that in terms of what I call body-mind relationships and environment, which is another way to refer to what integral theory calls the 4 quadrants. But just to scratch the surface of the other things that can turn out to be consequential that aren't part of woke psychotherapy's remit, apparently, things like attractiveness, height, chronic pain, illness, intelligence, learning style, developmental stage, in various lines, and I'll talk more about that later, perhaps in a future video, family structure and composition, home environment and neighborhood, which may be related to class, and history of trauma. Some of the ways that we're different, many of the ways that we're different, can be a source of prejudice and oppression and all of that. Some of the ways that we're different, however, are just circumstance, and there's not particularly a prejudice about it, but nevertheless, they're important for therapists to be aware of. You can't approach this work with a cookie cutter and treat all people the same. Every single client is fascinatingly and endlessly unique in their own way, and it's important to understand as much as we can. We can never know everything, but there's so much more that we can know about the people we work with, and to reduce them to a few categories and think that the way we need to respond to them and help them has to be circumscribed by those identities is so limiting. And this is an aspect of the reduction of categories that we can put people in order to understand them in terms of their group identity. I question the reduction to so few because it makes it easier to create groups based on these identities. And once you've created groups, you can begin to sort people out in terms of who's oppressed and who's oppressing. Who's the victim, who's the marginalized, who's the privileged, who's the power dominant group. And you can begin to really have an overly simplified view of human life and human relations. So my next point is, in a sense, the opposite. On the one hand, I think that woke psychotherapy and critical social justice reduces the number of identity groups to just so few, and their span of diversity is limited. On the other side of it, there's almost no mention of human universals, of the common things that human beings share. In fact, if you start to bring this up, I've seen and experienced this backlash. It's like any pointing to human universals seems to be a way to contradict the postmodern idea of constructed realities and the idea that we're born with a blank slate, and what we come to think and feel and do is entirely a matter of the cultural indoctrination that we receive, without a recognition of underlying common shared experiences and ways of being in the world that are true for all human beings. To assert this seems to raise this notion that it can only be motivated by some hegemonic drive for power by some white supremacist group or something. I know I'm putting a fine point on it, perhaps exaggerating a little, but there's no emphasis on human universals. And I think this is a problem, because without a recognition of human universals, what we have is division and antagonism and conflict, and no way to create bridges. Without a recognition of what we share as human beings, of our universally human nature, we're divided into groups that are at war with each other. There's the oppressors and the oppressed. And Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous saying has now become outdated. No longer are we not to judge each other by the color of our skin, for instance, but by the content of our character. We're to judge each other by these traits. It's as if we're being asked to put on an athletic jersey and declare which team we're on as we go out and do battle on the field over who's going to be in power. In a future video, I'll unpack this more in terms of the 4 quadrants, or in terms of body, mind, relationships, and environment. But I just want to make the point right now that I believe that we are as alike. We share as much as human beings as we are different. We're different in infinite ways, but there's almost an infinity as well of the things that we share as human beings. And a consequence of seeing the world of people in these opposing camps is that it provokes feelings of resentment and feelings of defensiveness or shame, guilt. And these don't go very far toward resolving things. Another consequence of dividing the world of people into 2 groups, of the oppressed and marginalized and the privileged and the oppressing, is that those who find themselves identified in an oppressed group begin to feel like victims, and their sense of agency and self-efficacy and personal responsibility for their lives is undercut. And there's a sense that the world must change, that other people have to change before they can be liberated. This is the antithesis of what an effective psychotherapy really ought to offer, which is building of agency, building of self-efficacy, building of personal responsibility. It doesn't mean ignoring and not addressing the experience of prejudice or mistreatment or injustice, but it doesn't focus there. And if there's something to be done about that, a tangible action that can be encouraged, then psychotherapy can do that. But it's not to simply convince somebody that they're merely a victim of an oppressive system. Another consequence of postmodern thought, the extreme version of it anyway, where reality is constructed and it's not objective, is that propositions of what's true cannot be questioned. If a person feels something is true, or they believe that it's true, it's to be accepted as true. And if, in addition, a world is painted in which people can be divided into the oppressive or oppressor group and the oppressed group, then we set up a situation where we can cultivate paranoia, persecutorial complexes. So we can't question things. If somebody asserts that they've been treated in a racist or a sexist or a homophobic manner, then that's what happened. It can't be examined. We can't look for evidence to see if that's actually true, which is a fundamental part of a lot of psychotherapy, particularly CBT, where our model of the world and our beliefs about things can be questioned, and we can look for evidence to either verify what we believe or decide that it's not actually true. There also does seem to be a push within woke psychotherapy to point out all of the microaggressions and all of the myriad possible ways that somebody is being mistreated or marginalized or experiencing injustice. Now, I'm not saying, as I said, I don't think that those things don't exist, but I think it's worthwhile to determine if they exist and to what degree they exist, and then to explore what one wants to do about it. Explore to what degree one should take it personally. One should allow one's sense of value and self-esteem to be impacted by these things. To look for and take every possible instance of microaggressions, for instance, as evidence that the entire system, the entire culture is rigged against you, I don't believe is a very helpful place to encourage people to be. To see oneself as continually under unjust existential threat just provokes anxiety and resentment, eventually rage, I suppose. Some of these points I'm making are related to and overlap with other things that I'm saying, but there's different ways to kind of look at it. Another way to look at this is that woke psychotherapy encourages the sense that we must be validated externally, that the world should validate us, and if it doesn't, then somehow we've got a great big problem. And the sense of validating oneself, of recognizing one's own value and worth, and resting in that, regardless of whether the world is going to affirm you or agree with you. If they're not getting in your way in an instrumental way, then they're just idiots, perhaps, that can be ignored. So, overemphasis on the need for validation from the outside world. And again, this overlaps with points I've already made, but I want to give it the term hypervigilance. That this really trains somebody to be hypervigilant for any instance of aggression coming from the world, any instance of non-validation, any instance of a microaggression. And this really hones the attention in a certain way. These things can always be seen, but it curtails noticing other things, broadening one's attention, not being hypervigilant all the time for any sign of danger to you because you're in a particular identity group. This hypervigilance is not helpful. The consequence of these kinds of things is to evoke a sense of fragility and erode any feeling of resilience or any effort to build resilience in one's being. And what follows is an abnegation of personal responsibility and a demand, an insistence that the world change itself in order for us to be okay. I believe and I've seen that when therapists come from this place of promoting and encouraging and even educating about these kinds of ideas, what they're doing is infantilizing their clients. And when we infantilize people, we get to feel virtuous about rescuing them. We get to feel that we're on the side of good and we're an advocate for justice, and we get to feel morally superior because we're doing that. But in the process, we're contributing to the erosion of the person's well-being and their ability to stand up on their own 2 feet in the world and make their way and deal with the slings and arrows of life in the most effective way that they can. When a therapist embarks on this path, I believe they veer from the path of actually helping clients to grow and to heal and develop and manage their lives. Instead, they're engaged in promoting an ideology, and they've lost track of what psychotherapy is supposed to be for. In their passion and zeal to promote an ideology that they believe is the true expression of compassion, they've lost sight of the purpose of psychotherapy. And to borrow an old saying that I think is apt, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I want to make 2 further points of critique that aren't related so much to the ideology and the practice of woke psychotherapy, but it has to do with the way people who advocate that approach deal with criticism, deal with challenge, deal with disagreement. And the first I'd call poisoning the well. This is a well-known strategy that usually gets called out in debates, where instead of attacking a person's argument, the rationale behind it, the evidence that supports it, instead of any of that, you poison the well, which means you cast aspersions on the person's character, their motivations, their intentions. You begin to say that the reason they're doing things is evil, in essence, even if you're not using that word. It's coming from racism, sexism, homophobia, some other form of prejudice, that the argument that is being presented is not to even be considered. It's like poison that's dropped in a well. You don't drink from it. You don't dip your bucket in and pull it up. That water is not to be had. The other defense of challenges and disagreements is the rejection of objective truth. Again, it's a postmodern turn here, and evidence, and that if you're actually trying to use these things to make your argument, then you're suspect. Then these are actually identified as the means of kind of the white supremacist power trip that the dominant culture wants to argue on its own terms, and that this is rejected. That it's in favor of that is the feelings of the oppressed. It's the personal stories and experiences and how one feels about those things that have all of the validity. And that if you're challenging the constructs of critical social justice in a rational way, even though they use rationality in making their arguments, you can be dismissed. Not only is your intention wrong, but the means of argumentation is wrong and oppressive. In essence, you couldn't possibly disagree with them except for reasons related to wanting to preserve your power. Woke psychotherapy will argue for diversity, but not want to include probably the most valuable form of diversity, which is perspective diversity. I know this video is long, and I appreciate that you've made it this far. Thank you for staying with me. At the same time, I feel that I've barely scratched the surface of the things that I want to say and I think need to be said. If there seems to be sufficient interest, I'll carry on and make more videos. I might carry on anyway. If you like this video, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel, and please leave comments. Let me know what you think. Share your response, your reaction, and share it with a friend or anybody that you think might be interested. As my hope is that this video will be the beginning of creating a community for people to come together and share their ideas and debate and argue with each other respectfully, I want to be clear up front. I'm open to debate and argument and disagreement. What I'm not open to is personal attacks. You can attack the idea, you can attack the argument, but not the person, whether that's myself or some other commenter. I won't tolerate it. So if I see that, I may or I may not give a warning, and then a person would be banned. I think it's important that this be not just a safe place where all of your ideas are going to be validated, but where you can feel that you as a person are not going to be attacked. And so that's not going to fly. If there is no pushback against the ideologically driven social justice warriors who are increasingly populating the field, I fear for the future of psychotherapy, but more importantly, for the mental health of those that it serves. Thank you for staying with me. I hope that you'll join me in future videos, and I hope that you'll leave me a comment. Until we meet again, so long.